This is the Everyday AI Show, the everyday podcast where we simplify AI and bring its power to your fingertips. Listen daily for practical advice to boost your career, business, and everyday life.
While the U.S. government and Anthropic continued trying to make up and be friends again, the rest of the AI world didn't stop. And it was actually some smaller players that were making big splashes this week, potentially signaling more competition at the top for the big four of Anthropic, OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft. That's because open source may finally be having its ChatGPT moment, as a new Chinese model might actually be closing the gap between proprietary US models and open source or open weight options. Oh, and Midjourney made some news as well. Yeah, that Midjourney that you probably haven't heard from in years. That's because they may be trying to disrupt the medical imaging space. Yeah, there's a lot going on if you don't follow every single day. And don't worry, I do that for you. So welcome to Everyday AI. And this is our Monday segment where we bring you only the most relevant news updates. I tell you what matters, what doesn't, and how you can use that information to grow your company and career. This is Everyday AI. So if you're new here, yeah, we do this every single day, daily, unedited, unscripted live stream podcast and free daily newsletter. So if you are new, please make sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I'd appreciate that. And then make sure you go to our website at youreverydayai.com. Sign up for the free daily newsletter each and every day. We recap the highlights from today's show, as well as give you all the other AI news you need to know just in a quick, digestible form. All right. So without further ado, let's go over the biggest stories of the week that you might have missed, and I'm going to break it down for you simply. All right, let's start at the top because, yes, at least at the time of this recording, we still don't have access to Fable 5 or Mythos 5 at whole. That's because the Trump White House and Anthropic are still trying to make things work. So actually a little bit of a controversial statement, maybe, from President Trump, as he told the Axios show on Friday that he considered Anthropic previously and or its CEO, Dario Amati, to be a national security threat, though he now believes the situation is improving. Yeah, he did say that. You might go want to listen to the interview yourself. We'll be linking it in today's newsletter, but he definitely say that he considered them a few weeks ago, whether he was talking about Anthropic as a whole or Dario Amati, to be a national security threat, though it's now, he says, it's improving. So the U.S. government, if you haven't been following along, the U.S. government recently imposed strict export controls on Anthropic, barring any country outside of the U.S. and foreign nationals within the U.S. from accessing Anthropic's most recent models called Fable 5 and Mythos 5. So Anthropic has completely disabled, in response to that, they've disabled public access to those models, Fable 5, which is the version of Mythos 5 with more guardrails. So yeah, but it's been down and gone now for almost a week since that export control. So the directive bars any foreign nationals, including foreign national Anthropic employees, from accessing these frontier systems. But because Anthropic can't instantly verify the exact citizenship of every single user on its platform, it was forced to yank both those models offline globally to remain compliant, and that's been about a week. So according to Axios in this new interview and story, the Trump administration's concerns were triggered by the Amazon reports detailing the vulnerability in Anthropic's technology, right? And a lot of reports said that was their CEO, Andy Jassy, and that led to the urgent discussions with the company leadership. Trump said he was initially alarmed by Anthropic's response, but was reassured after Amati acted quickly and responsibly, calling him nice and smart after meeting him at the G7 summit this past week. So the Pentagon has labeled Anthropic a supply chain risk, a designation typically reserved for foreign adversaries. And it was the first time a U.S. company had gotten that label from the U.S. government. So Trump did not rule out using emergency powers under the Defense Production Act if Anthropic does not comply with new standards, but stated he doesn't think that step will be necessary this time. Trump revealed that it was a competitor and part owner identified later as Amazon that alerted his administration about Anthropic's practice. So we went over this in detail. FYI, if you missed the story, let me just go ahead and pull the episode number. That was from Thursday, episode 801. So if you want more on the background on those developments, you go listen to that episode 801. But at least for now, Mythos 5 still offline. But the latest here, President Trump sat down with an interview with Axios. So yeah, if you missed that, definitely worth checking out. All right, our next story, and this seems to be an underlying theme this week on open source models apparently being considered at the highest levels. So Microsoft is moving its Copilot CoWork AI assistant to a usage-based pricing model. So kind of a couple pieces of news here. Number one, that Microsoft is going usage-based on Copilot CoWork instead of just including it or going with, a certain number that's included in a monthly subscription. That's number one. Number two is it's generally available, whereas before it was in preview. And number three, the most recent news, according to reports, is that they're actually looking at models like China's DeepSeek V4, a version that Microsoft may fine-tune just for Copilot CoWork to bring down costs. So, according to reports, the company is exploring a lower cost self-hosted AI model as an alternative to the more expensive Anthropic models that are currently powering Copilot CoWork by default. And Axios did report that Microsoft is considering, among others, DeepSeek V4, a Chinese-developed open source model, which could dramatically reduce costs, potentially charging just about 87 cents per million tokens compared to Anthropic's $50 per million tokens. So yeah, not the best at math, but that's like 18x cheaper or something like that. So Microsoft expects to announce its final model choice and deployment details within weeks, with any new option to be hosted on Azure to keep customer data within Microsoft's cloud infrastructure. So the shift responds to the high compute cost that we've been hearing about over the last month or two of agentic AI tools. Specifically, we've seen a lot of reports from enterprises, getting cloud bills that are pretty high, right? We saw that report a couple weeks ago. We don't know if it was legitimate or not, but apparently an enterprise company had a 9-figure bill from Anthropic, which is a lot, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars because they weren't keeping an eye on usage caps. So that's why open source models like DeepSeek V4 can cut costs, but they do require companies like Microsoft to handle additional hosting, optimization, and safety engineering, shifting some burdens away from commercial API providers. So there are obviously a ton of political and regulatory concerns as DeepSeek's Chinese origins have attracted scrutiny in Washington, raising questions about data security and compliance for U.S. companies. Microsoft has stated that any DeepSeek-based solution would be optional and subject to additional safety and compliance filters, aiming to address enterprise risk and regulatory requirements. So industry observers are watching for Microsoft's final decision, noting that total cost of ownership will depend not just on per token prices, but also on model performance, reliability, and the need for robust monitoring and safety systems. So this one, it is kind of intriguing, I'll say that to say the least, with Microsoft making this move and specifically, according to reports, looking at DeepSeek. So why is that noteworthy? Well, Microsoft obviously has good relationships and huge ownership stakes in both Anthropic and OpenAI, right? So traditionally, it's been the GPT models from OpenAI that have powered Copilot. They recently started offering some Claude models as well, but the Copilot CoWork was running Claude models by default. So CoWork is kind of the original technology from Anthropic that Microsoft essentially had their own version that was powered under the hood by Anthropic's Copilot technology. So what's interesting here with Microsoft looking at model providers like DeepSeek is, well, OpenAI and Anthropic have launched some serious concerns and regulatory steps that they've taken, going to the US government, accusing DeepSeek and other Chinese companies of distilling their models. So that's what's going to make this really juicy. If I'm being honest, a pretty bold step here from Microsoft, even though it is just according to reports to do this, considering two of their biggest and most important partners in OpenAI and Anthropic probably don't have the best view of DeepSeek for those exact reasons, because they've shown, right? Anthropic came out with a little bit more of a report how DeepSeek and other Chinese companies are essentially taking all of their hard work to make these open source models. All right. So our next AI story, staying in the same vein. Yeah, we have a new king of the open hill. That's Chinese startup ZAI is making a ton of headlines this week with their new open weights model, GLM-52. So ZAI has released that model, GLM-52, a massive 753 billion parameter language model, now available with unrestricted MIT open source licensing. So GLM 5.2 is designed for long horizon autonomous coding and engineering tasks, featuring a highly stable 1 million token context window, allowing it to handle extremely long documents and complex workflows. So the model is immediately accessible for download on Hugging Face, but yeah, you kind of have to be an enterprise with a little bit of compute to be able to do that, because it is a large model unless you're going to run a highly quantized version of it. But you can also use it through Hugging Face, through the ZAI API, and in over 20 third-party coding environments. The new model, which is pretty interesting here, it does look like it's very benchmarked, FYI, right? That's when a company maybe puts a little too much priority on getting certain benchmarks, but still, it outperforms most other open source competitors, and it is even now challenging the top proprietary models on several industry benchmarks, including SweetBench Pro, which I think is thankfully on its way out of being an important model for software engineering. Yet still, it is batting on some of these benchmarks, including SweetBench Pro, Frontier Suite, and others around GPT-5.5 and Anthropic's Claude Opus 4.8. So with Fable 5 off the shelf, right? I mean, GPT-5.5 and Opus 4.8 are the undisputed leaders. So pretty significant, even if it is maybe a little bit oversaturated and a little bit benchmarked, that an open source model, I won't say they've closed the gap, but they're starting to close the gap on frontier models. So there's obviously some use cases that you would absolutely not want to use GLM-52, mainly because it's not multimodal. So it's text only. So that's a big downside, right? So for someone like me, I'm constantly doing multimodal inputs, whether that's in Google's AI Studio, whether it's in, Anthropic Claude, Codex, ChatGPT, etc., right? So you can't have multimodal input or multimodal output, but with text only, GLM-52 does seem to be a competitor, and it is technically state of the art, even beating in a couple benchmarks, I kid you not, Fable 5, Opus 4.8, and GPT-5.5 on some more niche kind of front end coding design, some certain benchmarks out there. So pretty surprising considering that even the best open source models prior to this were generally, I would say, about 4 to 8 months behind the frontier counterpart. So still, GLM-52 is far behind, mainly in terms of capabilities because it's not multimodal. But for text only, at this point, it is only like 2 to 3 months behind, which is fairly impressive. And I think it does change the narrative especially when, kind of all of the rage in the second quarter and the summer so far has been shifting to token efficiency. I do think most companies, the biggest decision that they're going to make in 2026, similarly to what Microsoft is doing, looking at switching over from some Anthropic models to DeepSeek, is, well, most companies are going to have to start looking at their whether you're talking about token budgets, your AI spend, but switching over from token maxing to token efficiency, which we did a story on that in our Start Here series. So make sure you go check that out. But essentially, right, some of these agents run in loops nonstop. And as companies have kind of started to pluck away them kind of subsidizing, right? Because you see different reports, a $200 a month plan, if you were paying API costs, might cost, actually, if you were paying for those tokens, anywhere from, $10 to $15 to $20,000, for $200. So, essentially these companies have been eating those costs just to get users in and happy and sticky and to, get it rolled out into the organization. So a lot of companies are going to have to be looking at token efficiency. So pretty big news, both with the last two stories. Microsoft looking at open alternatives to power its Copilot CoWork as they switch to usage-based, and with the new ZAI 5 GLM 5.2 model, definitely one worth keeping an eye on. All right, our next AI news story: the CEOs of Anthropic and Google DeepMind and OpenAI met with G7 leaders and top US officials at the G7 summit in France. So the main news out of here, at least when it comes to an artificial intelligence standpoint, was a push for a US-led coalition on artificial intelligence. So Dario Amati and Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis urged the creation of a U.S.-led international coalition to set rules and standards for AI, citing urgent risks and the need for global cooperation. So President Donald Trump, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick represented the U.S. at the meeting, highlighting the high-level attention on AI governance. We also had Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who expressed support for U.S. leadership in forming an AI standards coalition, signaling growing international alignment on the issue. So the call for action comes after the U.S. government imposed export controls on Anthropic's latest AI models, Fable 5 and Mythos 5, which led the company to disable access due to the national security concerns that the government labeled. So Amati recommended that international cooperation should cover structured access to advanced AI models and trade of chips and critical components, specifically excluding China from these exchanges. So the tech leaders emphasized the urgent need to address AI risks in cybersecurity, bioterrorism, and intelligence, warning that unchecked AI could lead to major disasters if misused. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman advocated for a global forum to set standards for testing, risk analysis, and international collaboration, while OpenAI's Chris Lehan noted broad recognition that the U.S. should take the lead. So the big development out of G7 Summit, well, number one is that AI was front and center, right? So maybe it was just timing, circumstantial timing with the Mythos pull down, that this happened in the middle of it. So, especially when it comes to the rise of Chinese open source models, obviously from an adversarial perspective, the G7 collectively wants to keep an eye on what China is doing in AI, how they're using this technology, because like I've been saying for years, ultimately this will play out one way or another on the battlefield, right? This is, I think, why the G7 and world leaders are starting to pay more and more attention to AI, not just because of how it can be used in cyber warfare, but also on the actual battlefield, which is actually goes back to the initial kind of feud between Anthropic and the US government for how Anthropic did not want the military to use its models. So the other big takeaway here is obviously seemingly some international support for the US to take a lead in this G7 AI coalition, which makes sense, right? A lot of times other world leaders might not want to, step aside and let the US take a lead on something like this. But obviously, with the biggest and most powerful systems in the world residing in the US, it does make a lot of sense. All right, here's one that maybe didn't make as much sense. That's Midjourney. They've got an interesting pivot as I take a sip here of my coffee. AI moves too fast to follow, but you're expected to keep up. Otherwise, your career or company might lag behind while AI native competitors leap ahead. But you don't have 10 hours a day to understand it all. That's what I do for you. But after 700 plus episodes of Everyday AI, the most common questions I get is, where do I start? That's why we created the Start Here series, an ongoing podcast series of more than a dozen episodes you can listen to in order. It covers the AI basics for beginners and sharpens the skills of AI champions pushing their companies forward. In the ongoing series, we explain complex trends in simple language that you can turn into action. There's 3 ways to jump in. Number 1, go scroll back to the first one in episode 691. Number 2, tap the link in your show notes at any time for the Start Here series, or you can just go to starthereseries.com, which also gives you free access to our Inner Circle community where you can connect with other business leaders doing the same. The Start Here series will slow down the pace of AI so you can get ahead. Love the headline here. I believe this was from The Verge. They said Midjourney goes from generating cat images to full body ultrasound scans. Yeah, that's where we're at. So if you missed it, this could either end up being one of the biggest pivots or one of just the most confusing. But Midjourney CEO David Holz has revealed the company's first hardware product, marking obviously a very significant shift from its well-known AI image generator. So here's what they announced at their event late last week. So they announced the Midjourney scanner, which is a full body ultrasound device designed to capture detailed internal images of muscle, fat, bone, and organs using a ring of sensors. So Holz claims the scanner aims for image quality comparable to an actual MRI, though the scans should only take about 60 seconds, according to the company. So this pivot, well, you might be being like, okay, how did they literally go from one of the first AI image models, generating silly images, especially early on that didn't look very good, right? But Midjourney, I think, was, the big player early on before DALL-E and all these other players. But before Midjourney, their CEO, David Holz, actually had a relevant background. So he spent a decade as the CTO of Leap Motion, which is a company entirely focused on advanced hardware, optical spatial computing, and tracking human anatomy. And the other reason why this pivot maybe makes sense is, well, because Midjourney doesn't have any investors, so they can do what they want. So presumably, aside from there's a lot of lawsuits out there that are still pending, so we'll see where they land or settle in those. But presumably, Midjourney has a nice stack of cash, and they don't have, let alone companies like, SpaceX and Cerebras that just went public. Obviously, Anthropic and OpenAI will be going public fairly soon. So that changes what you can and can't do, and even in the time leading up. But Midjourney, as a company that's essentially bootstrapped and at a time, at least, they were printing money, they can make these kind of pivots. And with Holz's background, it maybe makes a lot more sense than people initially thought when they just saw the headlines. So let's talk a little bit more about the device. So it uses 40 butterfly ultrasound on chip imaging modules and 2 petaflops of processing power developed in partnership with the Butterfly Network. So the scanning process involves the subject stepping into a shallow pool of light and descending into water, where thousands of underwater sensors use ultrasonic waves to create 3D images of the person that is in the machine. So here's the other interesting part. Well, you're not gonna, maybe you will, but at least that's not the plan to find these things in a doctor's office. That's because Midjourney first plans to open a spa in San Francisco's Union Square by the end of next year, featuring 10 scanners, a gym, saunas, cold plunges, and hot tub equipped scanning rooms. So yeah, not something that they're, going to be rolling out to, AI equipped doctor offices. It seems like they're going to be opening spas with these scanners. So the company is currently focused on body composition maps, which do not require FDA clearance. That's the key there. But future medical applications would need regulatory approval. So users will be able to share their scan library with doctors and AI health tools. And Midjourney promised to prioritize data privacy as the launch approaches. So Hulse envisions the scanner becoming a faster, safer alternative to an MRI without radiation or magnets, and hopes for future FDA device classifications to enable broader data collection. So yeah, a strange one here, but the more you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? MRIs are expensive. They're not easy to get into. So we'll see how this is initially received. And we'll see, I think the telling thing will be how this is received outside of San Francisco. Because let's be honest, there's a decent chance no one knows how much this is going to cost, but this just seems like it's made for tech bros. Right. Let's be honest. It sounds like it's made for people with, who put, use stacks of cash to, as a booster seat, essentially. So I think people who have, millions of dollars of disposable income who live in Silicon Valley might see something like this and say, oh, absolutely. Outside of San Francisco, I mean, we'll see how this catches on, right? I'm from Chicago. I don't necessarily see this catching on. Again, it depends on price. Yes, there's all these other things. The spa, the plunge pool sounds great and all. But I don't know how many people would be interested in, and their kind of thought on this is the more that you scan, the more scans you get, the more likely you are to pick something up and detect a potential disease or abnormality sooner, which makes total sense. But I just don't know the amount of people who can afford something like that, or if there's an appetite outside of tight tech circles for people to be going, I don't know, monthly or even quarterly to get these scans. But regardless, hey, you got to swing for the fences to hit a home run. You're not going to put runs on the board by bunting every single time at bat. All right. Speaking of swinging for the fences, this one did not get a lot of coverage, but I decided to make it a main story because I think it's really important. So Cursor announced a new, well, they didn't actually announce it, but they kind of previewed it, that they're working on their own from scratch 1.5 trillion parameter model, and they are releasing a GitHub competitor. So two big pieces from Cursor. So days after officially being acquired by the now public SpaceX, Cursor dropped some major announcements at their Compile conference. So those are that they're launching a new made from scratch AI model with over 1.5 trillion parameters trained on scratch on more than 100,000 GPUs, making it potentially one of the largest and most powerful models to date. So that's what happens when you are now owned by SpaceX and you have access to all these compute factories, Colossus 1 and 2, that Grok / XAI / SpaceX, right? They're now just one thing they've invested heavily in. So Cursor says this new model is designed to be a generally intelligent assistant, moving beyond code generation to handle complex engineering tasks like planning, testing, and interacting with user interfaces. So a couple of reasons why I think just the model is important. Well, number one, their last model that they came out with that I believe was based on Kimi. So it was just a fine tune or built on top of an open source model. So Composer 2.5 was actually a really good model. It was the first time that Cursor, I think, had a model that a lot of people were starting to consider. And as we start to shift into the super app phase, all right, so make sure you go listen to episode 799, where we talked about AI super apps. And I did mention Cursor is a player now. you have to look at the cost efficiency. So, essentially with Composer 2.5, you got about maybe 90% of the power that you would get from something like Opus 4.8 at like 10% of the cost. So with Cursor going from scratch and now having that relationship with XAI, Grok, SpaceX, I do think we have to start paying a little bit of attention, a little bit more attention to Cursor, especially because I do think on the harness side, it is 1A and 1B in terms of, I do think still Codex on the harness side, 1A, and Cursor 1B. They have a great harness in the Cursor platform. So Cursor's CEO, Michael Truell, emphasized the scale and fresh training approach allows for better control over model behavior and supports a wider range of engineering workloads. The other big news is they did announce their Origin feature, a new Git native code hosting platform built for AI agents, which aims to challenge Microsoft's GitHub by supporting thousands of automated code operations daily and featuring automated conflict resolution. So Cursor's acquisition gives it access to SpaceX's vast computational resources, with analysts saying the combination of Cursor's reinforcement learning expertise and SpaceX's compute power could quickly make Cursor a top competitor to Claude Code, Codex, and even GitHub. So the GitHub play is interesting because we saw reports about a year and a half ago that OpenAI was developing their own GitHub kind of competitor, but it never came to fruition. So maybe that was one of those, side quests that was tabled. So Cursor maybe could start putting itself into the conversation. We'll see if we start shifting from talking about the big four of Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, and Microsoft, and maybe Cursor might thrust itself up into that first tier. All right. Our last big piece of AI news. Yeah, it seems GPT-5.6 from OpenAI could be days away. So according to reports, leaks, sleuths online, all that stuff, OpenAI is preparing to release its new GPT 5.6 family of AI models as soon as next week. So according to reports and leaks, you might see a couple different variations of the GPT 5.6 model, including the standard, a new mini, and pro versions that could debut together. Early access to GPT-5 Pro has reportedly already reached some Pro subscribers who report noticeably better understanding on technical prompts, though certain web development issues remain unresolved. So yeah, if you've been on, Twitter at all over the last 5 days, you'll see a lot of people, and I need to do a better job of, coming up with these use cases that I actually save. The thing is, I try to not take on as many of the visual use cases because I think there's plenty of people out there. And I don't think that for the most part, these are things aside from, creating things like decks, PowerPoints, Word documents, business dashboards. I think a lot of those are easy to compare. But I think, what a lot of people are doing is just 3GS, 3D worlds, coding games. I don't think for the majority of our audience, that's something that people are excited about. But that's why I think we've seen all these reports that apparently OpenAI may be A/B testing GPT 5.6 because people have saved, here's what GPT 5.5 Pro did when I said, create an interactive world model that you can walk through, just using 3GS or something like that. And people have those kind of saved, and all of a sudden it's 3-4 times better. So a couple more details. The new GPT 5.6 is rumored to push the context window to 1.5 million tokens, up from 1 million tokens in GPT 5.5, allowing for significantly longer and more complex conversations and coding sessions. So developers who think or believe that they have access to GPT 5.6 Pro say that it outperforms Anthropic's Mythos models in agentic coding tasks, raising the stakes in the competition for the AI-powered software development. Make sure to keep an eye on the newsletter this week. And obviously, if it does come out, you better believe we will be having a show, because there's a good chance that maybe as soon as today, maybe by the time that you hear this podcast, that we might have Fable 5 from Anthropic back. Again, according to reports, we could have GPT-5.6 as soon as this week. And we did earlier from Google themselves at their I/O conference last month. They did say that next month, which would be this month in June, they did say that they're going to be releasing their Gemini 3.5 Pro model. So in theory, this week, we could get access again to 3 state-of-the-art models. So pretty big week. Buckle in. Make sure you got your tokens ready or your API budgets in check, because there could be a lot of new model access rolling down the pipeline. All right, so that is it for our main AI news stories. So let's quickly go over everything else. This is the what's new and what's next. Just stories that didn't make our top cut, some rumors, some leaks, but let's go ahead and go through them quickly, bullet point style. All right, here we go. So Amazon, NVIDIA, and AMD invested $310 million into Odyssey ML to advance real-world AI understanding. Anthropic upgraded Claude design, adding custom design systems, code sync, and export features. That one, really good, FYI. OpenAI is reportedly preparing to integrate the library feature from ChatGPT into Codex. I would like that. I spent a lot of time trying to find all those files. xAI released their Grok Imagine Video 1.5 model. Looks pretty good. Adobe expanded their Firefly AI assistant to other tools in their stack, including Premiere, Illustrator, InDesign, and Frame.io with some new features. OpenAI released unified usage analytics and spend controls for ChatGPT Enterprise. Some new leaks show that Anthropic is working on a schedules feature for its always-on upcoming Claude Conway agent. Google rolled out their Ask Ad Manager beta, an AI agent for custom insights and troubleshooting for Google Ads. Like I said, GPT-5.6 and Gemini 3.5 are likely around the corner. Codex, this is the big one, released their record and replay workflow capture for Mac, so excluding some countries. And I do believe I'll have to check again at the newsletter. Most of the times, either on Friday or Monday, I'll ask you guys what you want for our Wednesday show, which is a hands-on demo. And I do believe that the new Codex record and replay one, which I was surprised. I thought Claude Design was going to win our poll, but it seems like everyone wanted the new record and replay feature, which is really cool. Google Gemini co-lead Noam Shazir left for OpenAI after Google acquired or acqui-hired him and his group from Character AI. This is a pretty big one, right? So one of the original authors on the Attention is All You Need paper that led to the Transformer, right? So one of the OGs of AI leaving Google Gemini after they spent $2.7 billion to join OpenAI. Another big get for OpenAI this week, former White House AI advisor Dean Ball joined OpenAI to lead frontier AI policy team. So some big hires for OpenAI after Anthropic landed Andre Karpathy a couple of weeks ago. Speaking of Anthropic, they released their Claude Code artifacts, which allows teams to share live coding artifacts for collaborative and interactive sessions. So very similar to Codex sites. xAI, already covered that one. Copilot CoWork is generally available. Like I said, downside though is usage-based pricing. And last but not least, Google released the open knowledge format. So kind of an alternative, or what could in theory be an alternative for an agentic communication system. So instead of markdown files, you might have OKFs if a lot of people adapt this. So that's it. That is a wrap for the AI news that matters. So y'all, I'm telling you, this is happening so fast and the pace is only going to pick up. All right. So you probably shouldn't be spending like 4 or 5 hours every single day, right? Taking all this work home for you. That's what I do. So make sure I try to keep these podcasts 30-ish minutes, right? even faster if you listen on 2X. So make sure you subscribe to the podcast, but you really need to be reading our newsletter. So make sure you go do that at youreverydayai.com. So thanks for tuning in. And FYI, if you are new here, Mondays, we do our AI news that matters. Wednesdays, we go hands-on with a kind of live demo with our AI at work on Wednesdays. Friday, we go over Friday features, which are new features that you can actually go use today. And I kind of give you the 101. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays, we rotate what those shows are. So if you're new here, that's kind of our weekly lineup. So thank you for tuning in. Hope to see you back tomorrow and every day for more Everyday AI. Thanks, y'all.
And that's a wrap for today's edition of Everyday AI. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a rating. It helps keep us going. For a little more AI magic, visit youreverydayai.com and sign up to our daily newsletter so you don't get left behind. Go break some barriers, and we'll see you next time.